Well, I want to welcome everybody to Psalm 45, which is unlike any psalm that we have read until this point, in that, at least on the surface, this psalm is not to God. This is a psalm to a royal couple. I learned a new vocabulary word, epithalamium. Epithalamium means a wedding song, and many of the commentators identify this as a song to a couple in the midst of getting married. But as you might imagine from having experience now with Psalms, there is no agreement who this psalm is about. So it'll range from the Midrash saying it could be about Abraham, Moses, David, the Messiah. Rashi, the classic biblical commentator, will say it's about God, and who's the female counterpart? That's the people of Israel. New Testament commentators will identify the king as Jesus. It's quite remarkable, though again, not surprising, that we don't know who the king is, though it seems, as we'll see from the description, to be an earthly king and a queen. In fact, not just any queen, but a queen who is a foreign queen, which also leads to the speculation that it's Solomon, who with his 1,000 wives had many foreign wives. What I'm going to look to do with you, though, today, because it's nice to kind of have a psalm as a springboard, is look at how kings are described and how queens are described. Specifically, there's a first half of verse 14, which is the only part of this psalm that I knew, not from Psalms, but from rabbinic writings, as a justification for why women were not to be witnesses in a traditional Jewish court. And so the Talmud, in the tractate that deals with oaths called Shavuot 30a, will quote the first part of verse 14, Kol kavuda vat melech penima. All honor, the entirety of honor or dignity of a king's daughter is within, and they'll add within the palace. A woman should not leave her home to be seen in public. So I want to focus in on that concept of how the rabbis would later use that line to describe the ideal woman. And it'll be a bit troubling to us in our more open life. And I want to talk a little bit about how we read an ancient text in terms of the dissonance, the tension with how men and women are described in such different ways than we relate to the dignity of women today. So that's what I'm looking to do with a psalm that is distinctive. Let me bring it up to read this unusual psalm with you, Psalm 45, that I have chosen to entitle Ode to a Royal Couple. And I hold short of calling it To a Royal Wedding, because it's not explicitly a wedding, and it may be ongoing description of a relationship between king and consort, or king and queen. Before I forget, I just want to point out that there will be 3 words that appear nowhere else in Hebrew sacred text. And it's already in verse 1. I translate a song of loves, Shir Yedidot. It could be a song of lovers. It's possible. The word rachash in the second verse, the first word, which I translate a stir, this is the only time in Hebrew scripture that it's used as a verb. It's not a unique word, but it's only used as a noun for creeping reptiles. So you get the sense of things moving, hence here used to describe the heart. So you can see the heart is palpitating. And one last unique word, which again is part of the beauty of poetry, the play on words. The first word in verse 3, describing the king, Yaf, Yafi, Ta. The doubling of Yafeh, which means pretty, I translate as doubly beautiful. And I smile to point out that the bride in verse 12, or the woman, is described as Yafyech. That's the third word in Hebrew, which is beauty, but it's in the singular. So the king gets a double portion of the beauty compared to the bride. All right, with that, let me just read the psalm and then circle back to describe some of the artistry of the composition, and then to hone in on how that verse is understood in the Jewish tradition to describe a model woman. For the conductor on Shoshanim of the Korachites, a maskil, a song of loves. Astir is my heart with a matter of goodness. I speak my craft for a king. My tongue is the stylus of an adept scribe. Doubly beautiful are you from any human, pouring grace into your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Strap your sword upon your thigh, mighty one, in your splendor and your glory, and in your glory succeed. Ride upon a word of truth and humble righteousness, and let your awesome Torah be at your right. Your arrows are sharpened, people shall fall beneath you, into the heart of enemies of the king. Your throne of God is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your realm. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your peers. Myrrh and aloes and cassia are all your garments. From ivory palaces, lutes make you happy. Royal princesses are your favorites. Standing is the consort at your right in gold of Ophir. Listen, daughter, and look, and incline your ear. Forget your people and your ancestors' house, and let the king be aroused by your beauty, for he is your superior, and bow to him. And daughter of Tyre, with a gift for your presence, they shall court your favor, the richest of the people. Entire honor of a king's daughter is inside. Filigree of gold for her garment. Upon embroidery she is led to the king. Maidens behind her, her companions are brought to you. They are led in happiness and rejoicing. They enter into the palace of the king. Replacing your fathers will be your sons, whom you will appoint princes in all the land. Let me make your name remembered in all generations. Therefore, peoples will praise you forever and ever. And so normally the closing verse we have seen repeatedly in Psalms is a conclusion of praise of God. That's the formula. In this case, it is in praise of the king, and it's ironic. Let me make your name remembered in all generations, and then we're not told who the name is of the king that we are to remember. We don't know, as is the nature of these poems to God, why this poem was included, since it's not written to God, though it is religious in the following way. And this again is interpretation - commentary. It describes a model king in godlike ways. Power. This king has power. He will succeed against his foes. He has, in verse 4, the sword upon his thigh. But what I find inspirational is the core description of the king, namely, his is a word of truth and humble righteousness. That quality is inspiring to me, that it doesn't stay in a militaristic place. It mentions it, but the focus is, verse 7, verse 8. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. It is grace that flows to your lips. So those qualities of character make this for me religious. To define religious as aspirational, of a higher self, of a higher sense of what it means to be led by a leader. And now a description of the palace that I find also quite remarkable. Here we learn in verse 9, we can smell the palace, myrrh, aloes, cassia. And the palace, you can hear the music of the musicians, of the lutes, and its beauty. It's ivory, a precious material. And now the shift in verse 10. There are these princesses in the plural around the king. I've chosen to translate it Shagal, which is also a rare word. It's only used in one other place in Tanakh, and it's not clear if it's specifically the queen, but it seems to be. In the other place that Shagal is used, that's again in verse 10, that's Nehemiah 2:6. In the JPS, it's translated as consort. Now, the gold of Ophir, that's a precious gold that's identified with Lebanon, 1 Kings 9:28 and 10:11. It's a gift from Hiram, who will help build the first temple. He presents to Solomon the gold of Ophir, which again lends itself with the image of the daughter of Tyre to this being Solomon and one of his brides, but obscure. Listen, daughter. Now, verse 11, for the first time, there is a direct address, verses 11 to 13, as the scribe addresses the queen. Just so I noted, backing up, this is also unique for Psalms, namely the psalmist being self-congratulatory. I speak my craft, Omor ani ma'asai lemelech, for a king. Lishoni eit sofer mahir. My tongue is either the pen or the stylus. Mahir means rapid or quick, but I've chosen to use the word adept, though you get the sense that there's a fluidity to what he writes, and that's part of his skill. So that's unique, the self-description. And here is the direct address to the queen, to the consort. Listen, daughter, and look. Incline your ear. Forget your people and your ancestors' house. Now you get that in the Torah reading of Ki Teitzei. When you take a foreign wife in battle, she, in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, was to have 30 days to mourn for her family, because she was to be fully brought in to the new husband's home. I was just watching on Netflix this series on matchmaking in the Indian, like the country of India. And there too, there's a description of a mother-in-law to be saying of the future daughter-in-law, she's going to have to learn the rules of our family and to forget what she was brought up to do. So that's classic traditional motif. The woman, in this case, apparently coming from another place. First advice, verse 11, forget your past. I translated Beit Avich, which can be your father's house, as your ancestor's house. And the role of a beautiful woman, and let the king be aroused by your beauty. Ki hu Adonaiach, for he is your superior. That's like Adonai. That's that same root, right? Which I've grown to translate for God as superior, and that's what it means. Your husband, the king, he's your superior, and it gets emphasized. V'hishtachavilo, like in the Aleinu, right? Nishtachaveh, and bow down to him, acknowledge him, look up to him, and here's what you're going to get out of it, daughter of Tyre. With a gift for your presence, they shall court your favor. The richest of the people. I was watching just a little of that TV show with Linda of the Indian matchmaker, and she had a groom in Mumbai with the mother-in-law I just described, and it's their engagement party, and she is a very wealthy woman, the mother-in-law, and just bringing all kinds of jewelry of great value and bestowing it on the daughter-in-law to be, who seems delighted. But I have in the back of my mind her words to the matchmaker, which is, she's going to have to learn the rules of my house. So that kind of traditional imagery of the words to the bride. But what will be troublesome, and I'm going to pace myself, is this will be also descriptions to future Jewish women, which is, know that your husband will be your master, be attractive to him, arouse him, and you will be rewarded. I will add for Jewish mystics, this is a description of the feminine nature of Shekhinah, the feminine dimension of the divine DNA. And a woman in the Zohar is the one who arouses the man. And the Kiddush cup, for instance, is held traditionally in the right palm, traditionally only since Jewish mysticism became central, and the left is underneath it. The left is the feminine, the right, the stronger, is the male, and the woman is there to support the male, and in Zohar is there to arouse the male to union. And in holding the Kiddush cup with the left hand under the right dominant power is in control, aroused, and enabling union, a symbol of Shabbat, the coming together of male and female and unity. So to finish up this, to talk a little bit about women, upon embroidery, this seems to be the pillows or the couch she's carried into the king on, with the maidens. Betulot can also be translated as the virgins behind her. Her companions are brought to you, and you get this feeling of celebration, which lends one to think of a wedding. They are led in happiness and rejoicing. They enter into the palace of the king. And verse 17, lending itself to wedding imagery, the promise of fertility. Replacing your fathers will be your sons, meaning you will be blessed with sons, whom you will appoint princes in all the land. And then that concluding line, let me, this is the scribe, make your name remembered in all generations. Therefore, peoples will praise you forever and ever. But let me focus on that key phrase, enter. I'm going to emphasize it, and then I'm going to remove the text so that I have the pleasure of seeing you and show you and teach you a little bit about how this verse, half a verse, 14a, gets used in Jewish tradition. So let me emphasize it when you can still see it. Kol kavuda vat melech penima. The entire honor of a king's daughter is inside. I've seen it translated as all the dignity of a princess is inward. Same idea. Again, the words in English have a multiple of possibilities. So let me first show you a tractate of the Talmud. This tractate is called Shavuot. It's not the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot deals with oaths, like the oaths that a witness will take in a court of law. And this is where I know this verse from. The Mishnah, which again is the rabbinic discussions of law edited in Israel in about the year 225, in the beginning of chapter 4 will say the following: the law of the oath of testimony applies to men, but not to women, which is to say, only men can take a vow in a court and not women. It doesn't explain why that distinction is made. So now to back up. In antiquity, women were dependent financially. That's true still in many traditional cultures, all the more in an agricultural setting where muscles were what earned the income. And so a woman was dependent on either her father, her husband, or her older brother for financial support. Now later rabbis would explain that women lacked independence financially meant that you couldn't rely on their testimony because they would have to curry favor with the man to whom they were dependent on. But the Mishnah doesn't explain why. It doesn't provide, if you will, that sociological justification. It just states it as a given in the first centuries of the Common Era. And now the rabbis of Babylonia, they have the discussions as to try to understand the Mishnah, the holdings of the earlier rabbis who are extrapolating from the laws of Torah. Now the Torah will say that it will take Shnei Edim, two witnesses to establish a matter. And then in Deuteronomy 19:17, V'amdu Shnei Anashim Asher Lahem Hariv, and there will be two individuals who stand in dispute. And the rabbis will say, here in the Talmud, how do we know that women cannot be witnesses? Because it says Shnei Edim, two witnesses, and then it will say Shnei Anashim, two men, and therefore witnesses can only be men. That's called a Gezerah Shaveh. But it's not convincing because the rabbis will not, there'll be a number of proofs based on these twos, parallel use of two. And so here's what the Talmud will then say in 30a. It is not customary for a woman to appear in court because it is written, now quoting our verse of Psalms, the entire honor of a king's daughter is inside. And then they go back to going these twos. But that's where it gets quoted. Now, even there, it doesn't seem like it's not a legal statement. It's rather kind of a description of the role of a woman. And the early rabbis will expand on that in Midrash. Midrash, again, are the commentaries. So here's a Midrash from Numbers Rabbah, in which they'll say, the daughter of a king is all dignified within. Her clothing is of embroidered gold. The king alludes to Moses. Her clothing is of embroidered gold. This alludes to Aaron. Okay, that's an aside. It will say that the embroidered gold means that she is qualified to marry a priest. Another Midrash. Midrash Leviticus Rabbah 20:11, saying of a woman, "What is your merit?" And she says, "The beams of my house have never beheld the hair of my head, nor the seam of my undergarment." Means she's so modest. She's never undressed, even in full view of her beams of her house. And then they say, "The daughter of a king is all dignified within. Her clothing is of embroidered gold." So here's another place that verse gets quoted. But here is where it gets to be more problematic for me. Listen to Maimonides, who will be the codifier of Jewish law. He lives 1135 to 1204, born in Cordoba, Spain. He'll die in Cairo. And he writes in his tractate on the laws of relationships, 1311, "Women may come and go to their family home to visit and to a party in order to bring loving kindness to her friends and relatives, so they will visit her as well. For she is not in prison and cannot be not to go out and come in. It is, however, unseemly for a woman to go out constantly, outside and in the streets, and a woman should prevent his wife from doing so any more than once or twice a month, as needed. For," now quoting "for a woman's beauty is to dwell inside the corners of one's house, as it is written," and now quoting 45:14, "the daughter of the king is all dignified within." And then the rabbis will debate. And the comment in this art scroll on that, where it gets quoted, will be the early deciders of Jewish law, post-Talmud. These are like the children of Rashi. So 11th, 12th century will say, "Why can't a woman testify?" Because normally a woman could send somebody else to represent her. So a woman can be a litigant because she can have a representative. But a witness needs to take an oath. And a woman can't take an oath. And they'll say, and therefore her testimony is inadmissible. Why can't she take an oath? Because a female witness would not typically appear in court. Okay, a witness must come to court. They just assume it based on that verse. And when I, as a rabbinical school student, was on the cusp of dealing with this question of women's rights and equality in the Jewish tradition, that verse is the one that I kept hearing repeatedly, traditionally recited, which was that as Jewish law unfolded, the modesty of a woman was not to be put on a witness stand and grilled. And we do know that it can be rough to be on a witness stand. But that quality of both fragility of a woman or untrustworthiness got, if you will, made apologetically beautified to say the dignity of a woman is to be indoors in her castle as a queen. Not just that queen of that psalm, but women in general. And that troubles me because it seems to undermine the dignity of women, with women having the respect of the ability to have their oaths honored. But I do pause with my last comment to know that we can't always judge the past by the present. An important philosopher, Ken Wilber, writes in a book of his called A Brief History of Everything that economics do define different periods in human history of what was understood as right or wrong. We see that with slavery. We can't judge a history of human labor in a post-labor industrial age. And likewise, how women were seen as lacking economic power in an earlier time was reality. And with that inequality, that doesn't have a place in an information age. But there is this definition of adulthood for me. And that is the difference between a child and an adult is for a child, things are black or white. For a child, a parent is all-knowing and powerful. And adulthood, which is part of teenage confusion, is the recognition that your parents can be fallible and can be limited. And real maturity is to know that's true for each of us. And that's true for different historical periods. There can be wisdom in the past, and it can shine brightly, but it can be incomplete in another time and place. And I find with Psalm 45, there is a charm in the description of the palace. There is inspiration in the moral nature of the king, aspirationally, and at the same time, the subservience of the queen is of another time, I hope. And we do know at the same time, as a culture, we're still clearly in transition for equality between men and women, let alone between races as well. With that, I welcome some of your thoughts on Psalm 45, an ode to a royal couple. Arnold?
I mean, this seems like a rationalization of what was custom probably for thousands of years. That that in the Middle East it was a male-dominated society. It always has been, and so the use of using this verse 14. It's a rationalization of what is. I mean, the rabbis could have said, yes, women can testify in a court. Look, the daughters of Zelophehad were able to petition Moses. Well, if they were able to petition Moses, why can't women petition in a court, a rabbinic court or a civil court, whatever? So they just had to rationalize what was already there in my mind.
Thank you, Arnold. I taught that description of the daughters of Zelophehad just a couple of weeks ago, in that it's the final paragraph of the entire book of Numbers. It revisits the 5 daughters of Zelophehad and for the first time lists their names as they're told that yes, distinctly, they can inherit from their father when he had no sons, which is to say, in the Bible, there is inequality between men and women and inheritance. If Zelophehad had one son, that son would have inherited all the land from the father, and the daughters, the 5 of them, would have gotten nothing. And so one, as you say, Arnold, that quality of a patriarchal culture in which property is transmitted from male to male was a given in the ancient Near East, and it was given in Europe in terms of inheritance laws. It was a given in America in many inheritance state laws. It's true currently in much of the world, be it Africa or Asia, in traditional cultures. But what is also true, as you say, in Middle Ages, for the rabbis living in either Muslim Europe or Muslim countries or Christian Europe, I say that because Spain was both Christian and Muslim, the justification would be this use of that verse in Talmud. They didn't ride with it in the Talmud. It's more of an aside. It's like, let me just remind you that a woman needs to be modest and stay in the home. Therefore, it's obvious that she shouldn't be testifying in court. But that would get much more, if you will, brought to the foreground in later Jewish law as almost the proof. Almost, because Psalms is not law, it's description of society. One last comment, and then Kaddish, if there is. All right.
Rabbi,
Yes.
yeah, when you said oaths earlier, it triggered in me. In the Torah, if a woman is married, doesn't her husband have to approve of whatever oath she might make?
Yes.
Or her father if she's not married?
That's correct.
And so does that tie into this whole circle?
Absolutely. It's another example, not unlike inheritance rights. A woman, her vows, and a vow was a pledge to God. An oath, in this case, was different than an oath to another person. It was an oath to God, and that would only be binding if her husband approved and if she was unmarried, her father. So women were not seen as independent. There were exceptions for widowers, or even women who never married, who had their own financial independence. But I'll only underscore, from my understanding, is the reality is that economy often drives cultural distinctions, particularly in this case, around women's roles and men's roles. So Psalm 14 is a remarkable look into a model royal couple. We conclude with Kaddish for those observing a yurtzeit or who are in mourning. We join together. Yitkadal, Yitkadal, Shemei Rabbah, Bi'alma, Ivra, Kirute,
V'yamlich Malchutei, Chaychon V'yamechon, V'yid L'chol Bet Yisrael,
Ba'agala,
Ba'agala V'zman Chariv, V'imru, Amen.
Yehei
Shmei Rabba Mekra,
Ve'olam
V'olam V'amei Amaya,
Yitbarach
Barak V'yishtabach, Yitba'ar V'yitrama, Yitnaseh, Yitar V'yitaleh, V'yitalal, Shmei D'Kedusha, V'yifu, Mikol Birchata, V'shirata, Tushbichata, V'nechemata, Damiram, Bialma, V'imru, Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu, V'al Yisrael, V'imru, Amen.
Oseh
Say Shalom B'mimah, Hu Yaseh Shalom,
Aleinu
V'al Kol Yisrael,
V'kol Yoshvei Tevel,
V'imru, Amen.
Amen.
So next week, we'll look at Psalms 46 and 47, the following week 48 and 49, and then we'll just have one psalm, and that'll be Psalm 50, and then we'll stop until after high holidays. So again, thanks to each of you for tuning in and keeping the learning moving forward. Have a good day.